She thought ignoring her would be easier than dealing with her, but Rebecca Collins had no idea she was about to silence an entire hospital with one mistake. The lobby buzzed with the usual morning chaos, stretchers rolling past, monitors beeping in distant hallways, the sharp scent of antiseptic lingering in the air, and people moving fast enough that no one had time to notice who got left behind. No one except the old woman sitting quietly near the far wall, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight despite the years that showed in her silver hair and simple clothes. Margaret Hale didn't look like someone important, not in a place where status often announced itself through tailored coats, polished shoes, and confident voices demanding attention. She looked like someone who had been waiting a long time, not just this morning, but maybe her entire life. A few people glanced at her and quickly looked away, their eyes sliding past her as if she were part of the furniture, another invisible presence in a place that only noticed urgency, money, or authority. Behind the reception desk, Rebecca adjusted her crisp uniform, her long blonde hair falling perfectly over her shoulders as she scanned the room with practiced efficiency, deciding in seconds who mattered and who didn't. When her gaze landed on Margaret, it lingered just long enough to make a judgment, and just short enough to dismiss her completely. Rebecca had seen thousands of faces in this hospital, and she prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged and who didn't within a glance measured in less than a second. To her, Margaret was an interruption waiting to happen, a problem that didn't deserve time. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting a sterile glow across the marble floors that reflected hurried footsteps and clipped conversations. But around Margaret, there was a strange stillness, as if the noise bent around her and left her untouched. She didn't check her phone, didn't fidget, didn't call out for help. She simply waited, her eyes steady, observing everything with a quiet awareness that no one noticed. And that was the first mistake they all made, because in a place built on urgency, the calmest person in the room was the one they should have paid attention to the most, but instead, they let her sit there, unseen, unheard, and completely underestimated. Rebecca tapped her pen against the desk, the sharp clicking cutting through the low murmur of conversations as her patience wore thin, because to her, waiting meant inefficiency, and inefficiency meant weakness, and nothing irritated her more than someone who did not understand how things worked in a place like this. She glanced again at the old woman, still seated, still unmoving, still refusing to follow the unspoken rule that everyone else seemed to obey, which was to either belong or leave. A young nurse leaned over the counter beside her and whispered quietly, asking if the woman had checked in, but Rebecca simply shook her head with a faint smirk, the kind that carried more judgment than words ever could. She straightened her posture, smoothed the front of her uniform, and made a decision that felt small in the moment but would echo far beyond it. Stepping out from behind the desk, her heels clicking in steady rhythm across the polished floor, she approached Margaret with the confidence of someone who believed she was maintaining order. Up close, she barely concealed the impatience in her expression as she looked down at the seated woman, her voice controlled but edged with condescension as she asked if she had an appointment, if she was in the right place, if she understood how this hospital operated. Margaret lifted her eyes slowly, meeting Rebecca's gaze without hesitation, and there was something in that look that did not match the assumption being made, something steady and unshaken, but Rebecca dismissed it instantly, because she had already decided who this woman was. When Margaret began to speak, her voice calm and measured, explaining that she was here for a scheduled meeting, Rebecca cut her off with a raised hand, her tone sharpening just enough for nearby patients to notice. She explained, louder now, that important meetings were arranged through proper channels, that people did not simply walk in and expect access, that there were standards to maintain. Few people nearby turned their heads, drawn by the shift in tone, their curiosity building as the moment stretched. Margaret did not react the way Rebecca expected. She did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not defend herself with urgency. Instead, she simply remained seated, her hands still folded, her posture unchanged, as if the words being thrown at her did not have the power to move her at all. That stillness unsettled Rebecca more than resistance would have, but instead of stepping back, she leaned further into her authority, unaware that every word she spoke was pulling her closer to a line she could not see, and once crossed, there would be no stepping back from it. The tension did not break. It thickened, stretching across the lobby like a wire pulled too tight. And Rebecca could feel the eyes gathering now, not just glancing but watching, waiting, measuring how far she would go. She let out a quiet breath and shifted her weight, her voice rising just enough to carry beyond the immediate space, turning a private exchange into something public, something performative. She explained again, slower this time, as if speaking to someone who could not understand, that without a verified appointment, without proper documentation, there was nothing she could do, that this hospital operated on structure, on order, on standards that could not simply be bypassed. A man standing nearby paused mid-sip of his coffee. A woman seated across the room leaned forward slightly, and even the front desk staff grew quieter, their movements slowing as the moment unfolded. Margaret remained exactly as she was, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had seen this scene play out before in different rooms, with different faces, but always the same assumptions. Rebecca interpreted that calm as defiance, and defiance, in her mind, required correction. She gestured toward the seating area behind them, suggesting firmly that if Margaret needed assistance, she could contact the appropriate department through proper channels, that lingering here was not productive, that this was not a place for uncertainty or confusion. The words sounded professional, but the tone beneath them carried something sharper, something unmistakably dismissive. A security guard at the far end of the lobby glanced over, sensing the shift, though he did not move yet. Margaret slowly rose to her feet, not hurried, not pressured, but deliberate, her movement quieting the space more effectively than any raised voice could. She stood there, facing Rebecca now at eye level, not challenging, not retreating, simply present in a way that demanded to be acknowledged. For a brief second, Rebecca hesitated, just a flicker, a hesitation she did not understand, before pushing forward again, asking one final time for confirmation, for proof, for something that would justify this interruption. And in that suspended moment, with the fluorescent lights humming above and the entire lobby holding its breath without realizing it, Margaret drew in a slow breath, preparing to say something that would change everything, though no one there yet understood just how much. Margaret did not raise her voice, did not shift her stance, did not offer documents or explanations the way Rebecca expected. Instead, she simply looked at her, calm and unwavering, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided long before either of them stepped into this room. And then she spoke, her voice low but clear enough to cut through the tension that had settled over the lobby like a quiet storm. "I believe they are expecting me," she said, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no room for doubt, yet offering no details that Rebecca could grasp onto. Rebecca let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only disbelief sharpened by irritation, and she glanced briefly at the small crowd that had formed, aware now that she was being watched, that this interaction had become something more than routine, something she needed to control. She folded her arms slightly, her posture tightening as she leaned into the authority she had always relied on, and responded with a tone that was just polite enough to avoid complaint, but firm enough to assert dominance, explaining once again that without a name on the schedule, without confirmation, without the proper process, there was nothing to verify, nothing to proceed with, nothing that justified this interruption. The words landed heavier this time, echoing in the quiet space as the background noise of the hospital seemed to dim, as if the building itself was listening. Margaret did not react immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to make Rebecca uncomfortable, though she masked it quickly, maintaining her expression, her control, her certainty. Then Margaret inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging something unseen, and said just one sentence, steady and precise. "You may want to check again." There was no challenge in her voice, no hint of urgency, only a quiet confidence that did not match the situation Rebecca believed she was managing. A flicker of doubt crossed Rebecca's mind, brief but real, before she dismissed it, because everything about this woman's appearance contradicted the possibility that she belonged anywhere beyond the waiting area. Still, the silence that followed felt different now, heavier, expectant, and somewhere behind the desk, a phone began to ring, sharp and sudden, breaking the moment in a way that felt less like coincidence, and more like the first crack in something much larger that was about to unfold. The ringing phone did not stop. It cut through the lobby with a sharp persistence that pulled every eye back toward the front desk. And for a brief moment, Rebecca hesitated, her gaze flicking from Margaret to the source of the sound, as if deciding which interruption mattered more. But control had always been her priority, so she turned away from Margaret with a tight expression and reached for the receiver, her movements quick, efficient, practiced. "Front desk," she said, her tone clipped, still carrying the authority she had just displayed. But whatever came through the line changed something instantly. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that the shift was visible in the smallest details. The way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes narrowed, the way her voice lowered without her realizing it. "Yes, she is here," Rebecca said slowly, her earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more uncertain, and the room seemed to lean in closer, sensing the change before understanding it. A nurse behind the desk stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, watching Rebecca carefully, while the security guard at the far end took a step closer, not out of urgency, but out of instinct, as if something unseen had just moved through the space. Rebecca's grip on the phone tightened slightly as she listened, her expression shifting again, this time more noticeably, the faint color draining from her face as the words on the other end continued. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was different, softer, stripped of the sharp edge it carried before. I understand," she said, almost quietly, before nodding even though the person on the other end could not see her. She lowered the receiver slowly, placing it back into its cradle with care, as if the act itself required more attention than usual, and then she stood there for a second, unmoving, her mind racing to catch up with something she had not anticipated. The murmurs in the lobby began to rise again, low and curious, as people exchanged glances, sensing that something had shifted but not yet knowing why. Rebecca turned back toward Margaret, but this time her steps were slower, less certain, her posture no longer rigid with control but held together by something else, something closer to unease. When she reached Margaret, she opened her mouth to speak, but the words did not come immediately, and for the first time since this began, it was not Margaret who was being measured by the room. It was Rebecca, standing there under the fluorescent lights, realizing that whatever she thought she understood about this situation had just been quietly, completely undone. Rebecca swallowed, the motion small but visible, as if something had caught in her throat that she could not quite force down, and when she finally found her voice, it came out quieter than before, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Ma'am, could you please confirm your name again?" The question hung in the air, no longer a demand, no longer a dismissal, but something closer to a request, and that alone was enough to shift the energy in the room. Margaret did not move immediately, her gaze steady as she looked at Rebecca, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a calm understanding that made the moment feel heavier than it should have. Around them, the lobby had grown noticeably quieter, conversations fading into whispers, footsteps slowing, as if everyone present could sense that something important was unfolding, even if they did not yet understand what. Margaret took a slow breath, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged, and then she spoke again, clearly, deliberately. "Margaret Hale." This time, the name did not disappear into the noise of the hospital. It landed, solid and unmistakable, and the effect was immediate. The nurse behind the desk stiffened, her eyes widening slightly as recognition flickered across her face, and one of the younger doctors nearby stopped mid-step, turning his head sharply toward them as if he had just heard something impossible. A second phone began to ring, then another, the sound echoing in quick succession, not chaotic, but coordinated in a way that felt deliberate, controlled. Rebecca's fingers tightened at her sides, her mind racing now, replaying the words from the call, connecting them with the name she had just heard, and the realization began to take shape, slow and undeniable. She glanced toward the hallway behind the desk just as a senior administrator appeared at the far end, walking quickly, almost urgently, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something more focused, more serious. People began to move without being told, stepping aside, clearing space, their attention drawn fully to Margaret now, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked. Rebecca took a small step back, almost without realizing it, her earlier confidence dissolving into something else entirely, something closer to disbelief. Because in that moment, she understood that this was no longer a situation she controlled, and whatever was about to happen next would not only redefine the woman standing in front of her, but also expose just how wrong she had been from the very beginning. The administrator did not slow down as he approached, his polished shoes striking the floor, with a rhythm that carried authority without a single word being spoken. And the moment he stepped into the open space of the lobby, the atmosphere shifted completely, as if the building itself recognized his presence and adjusted accordingly. Conversations faded into silence, staff members straightened their posture, and even those who had been watching out of curiosity now watched with something closer to tension. He stopped a few feet from Margaret, his eyes locking onto her with immediate recognition, and without hesitation, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture so subtle, yet so profound that it sent a ripple through everyone standing nearby. "Ms. Hale," he said, his voice steady but carrying a respect that had not existed in this space just moments ago. "We have been expecting you." The words landed with quiet force, and for a brief second, no one moved, no one spoke, as the full weight of what had just been revealed settled into the room. Rebecca stood frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile the image she had formed with the reality unfolding in front of her, every assumption she had made unraveling in real time. The younger doctor who had turned earlier now stepped closer, his expression no longer curious but attentive, while the nurse behind the desk lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of every word that had been spoken before. Margaret did not react with surprise, did not acknowledge the shift with any outward display. She simply nodded once, calm and composed, as if this response had always been inevitable. The administrator gestured toward the secured hallway behind him, his movements careful, deliberate, as if guiding someone whose presence carried more weight than the room could fully contain. "The board is ready," he added quietly, and that single sentence sent another wave of realization through the space, because it confirmed what many were only beginning to suspect. This was not a routine visit, not an ordinary patient, not someone who had wandered into the wrong place. Rebecca took a small step back, her breath shallow, her earlier confidence replaced entirely by a growing awareness that she had not just misjudged a person, she had misjudged someone whose name alone had the power to change how this entire hospital moved. And now, standing under the same fluorescent lights that had once made Margaret invisible, Rebecca felt the weight of every second she had chosen to look away. No one spoke as Margaret began to move, and it was not because they were told to be silent, but because something deeper had taken hold of the room, something that demanded stillness without instruction, as if every person present understood, on some level, that they were witnessing a moment that could not be interrupted. The administrator stepped slightly ahead of her, guiding but never leading, his posture careful, respectful, while staff members instinctively shifted aside, creating a clear path through the center of the lobby. The same space that had ignored her minutes ago now seemed to open for her without resistance. Every movement around her adjusted to her presence, every sound lowered in quiet acknowledgement. Rebecca remained where she was, her hands no longer steady at her sides, her thoughts racing through every word she had spoken, every assumption she had made, each one now echoing louder than anything else in the room. She watched as the younger doctor straightened his coat, his expression sharpened with sudden awareness, and the nurse behind the desk lowered her eyes, avoiding direct contact, as if even looking at Margaret now carried weight. The security guard, who had once been ready to intervene, stepped back into position, his stance no longer alert but composed, as though recognizing that his role in this moment had changed completely. Margaret walked at an unhurried pace, her steps even, her gaze forward, not seeking acknowledgement, not reacting to the shift around her, but fully aware of it all. As she passed Rebecca, there was a brief moment where their proximity brought everything into sharp focus, the contrast between them no longer defined by appearance or authority, but by something far more undeniable. Rebecca opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, perhaps to correct, perhaps to apologize, but no words came, because in that instant, she understood that nothing she could say would undo what had already been revealed. Margaret did not stop, did not look directly at her. But there was a subtle pause in her movement, a fraction of a second that felt deliberate, as if acknowledging the moment without needing to address it. Then she continued forward, following the administrator toward the secured hallway, where the doors opened before they reached them, triggered not by proximity sensors, but by someone inside who had been waiting. As the doors closed behind her, the quiet remained, heavier now, more defined, and in that silence, the entire hospital seemed to absorb what had just happened, not through announcements or explanations, but through the undeniable shift in how one name had changed everything. The doors closed with a soft, controlled click, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the entire lobby had been paused in place, waiting for permission to return to normal. But normal did not come back the same way it had before. The hum of the fluorescent lights returned first, then the distant beeping of monitors, then the quiet shuffle of footsteps. But everything felt different now, slower, more aware, as though every person present had just been reminded of something they had forgotten. Rebecca remained where she stood, her posture no longer defined by control, but by stillness, her eyes fixed on the closed doors that Margaret had just passed through, replaying every second in her mind with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. The words she had spoken, the tone she had used, the way she had dismissed someone without hesitation, all of it now carried a weight she had not anticipated, and there was no escaping it. Behind the desk, the nurse resumed typing, but her movements were quieter, more careful, and the younger doctor who had stepped closer earlier now adjusted his badge, his expression thoughtful, as if reconsidering something deeper than just the moment that had unfolded. The administrator did not return right away, and no one asked questions, because somehow, answers no longer felt necessary. They had seen enough. Rebecca finally exhaled, a slow, unsteady breath, and lowered her gaze, her hands coming together in front of her, as if searching for something to hold on to, something to ground her in a reality that had just shifted beneath her feet. For the first time that day, she looked around the lobby not as someone in control, but as someone observing, really observing, the people moving through the space, the ones waiting quietly, the ones overlooked, the ones she might have dismissed without a second thought. And in that quiet realization, something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to matter. Somewhere down the hallway, behind those closed doors, decisions were being made, conversations were unfolding, and Margaret Hale was exactly where she was meant to be, while out here, in the open space she had once been invisible in, her presence lingered like an echo that could not be ignored. And though no announcement was made, no explanation given, the lesson settled into the room with quiet certainty, carried in the way voices softened, in the way eyes lingered a little longer, in the way assumptions hesitated before forming, because that day, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Margaret had